section 6.9, dealing with complex numbers. Complex numbers have a portion that is real and a portion that is imaginary. So, for example, in a plus bi, a is the real portion and b is the imaginary portion. So, in questions 1 through 4, we're just going to practice writing in a plus bi form so that we can separate the real from the imaginary. So, in number 1, I could simply divide 8 by 5 and divide 3 by 5. And now in this form right here, notice that the real portion is 8/5 and the imaginary portion is 3/5. The reason that we want to be able to separate these is that a real number is something you can graph on a two-dimensional plane. A imaginary number is something you need a three-dimensional plane to graph. So they can't be combined in any way. So we want to be able to separate them out. Number 2 here, I would get a negative divided by a negative becomes a positive 2. Ooh. Positive divided by negative becomes a negative. In this case, my a value is 2 and my b value is a negative 1. Hopefully we're getting the hang of it. Number 3 takes it up a big notch. In fact, let's go ahead and do number 4 first. In number 4, to get it in a plus bi form, if I have got to get I out of the denominator. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by I. And when I do that, I get 40i plus 20i squared divided by I squared. And from the previous section, we know that I squareds actually equal a negative 1. So let's go ahead and replace these I squared values with negative 1. And now when I simplify, I have a negative 20 plus 40i all over a negative 1. Putting that real portion first. Now let's go ahead and do our last step. A negative divided by a negative becomes a positive, and a positive divided by a negative becomes a negative. All right, I'm going to go ahead and erase the board and attack number 3. It's a little bit more difficult. In number 3, I can't just multiply by I top and bottom in order to clear it because I have terms down here. Whenever you have terms, you're going to have to multiply it by something called the complex conjugate. And that means that your terms are going to stay the same, and the sign in between them is going to change. This was plus, now it will be minus. Now, if you don't get this down in this example, don't worry, I have another one coming up later. In the denominator, you'll multiply by this complex conjugate, and notice how they are in the form of a plus b times a minus b. So we know those middle terms are going to drop out. 1 times 1 is 1. Here I'm going to get a negative 2i plus 2i. That cancels. And a positive times a negative gives me a negative 4i squared. In my numerator, I can FOIL as usual. I get 4 minus 8i minus 6i plus 12i squared. Now let's go ahead and attack our I squareds and change them to negative 1s. And in the denominator, I get a positive 4. In my numerator, I have 4 minus 12, which is actually a negative 8. And I can combine these two like terms and get negative 14i. Now in my denominator, let's go ahead and simplify. I have negative 8 minus 14i all over 5. And in my final step, I get negative 8/5, that's the real portion, minus 14/5, that's the imaginary portion. Thus, it's multiplied by I, or we have the I there to show that. All right, if you didn't follow all of that, there's one more example coming. And let's practice a little bit more with our complex numbers. In number 5, we're simply adding. So we're going to add real portion to real portion. 6 plus 3 is 9. Negative 5 plus 4 is a negative 1. remember, you can add real to real and imaginary to imaginary, but you can't combine them any further. Here we're subtracting, so we need to go ahead and distribute that negative through, and I get 2 plus I minus 7 plus 2I. Now let's go ahead and combine our real portions. 2 plus 7 is 9, and 1I plus 2I is 3I. All right, how about in number 7 when I'm distributing? We need to distribute that 3I through both. When I multiply it by the first, I get 36I. And when I multiply it by the second term, I get a negative 9I squared. Notice that we can simplify that I squared. Let's go ahead and change it to a negative 1. And now a negative times a negative becomes a positive, and I have 9 plus 36I. All right, in number 8, we're going to go up a notch, and we're going to utilize FOIL. First, 5 times 2, which is 10. Outer, 5 times negative 7, which is a negative 35I. Inner gives me an 18I. And last gives me a negative 63I squared. Now let's go ahead and change our I squared to negative 1 and combine like terms in the same step. My I squared does indeed become negative 1. And so here a negative times a negative becomes a positive. And 63 plus 10 is definitely 73. A negative 35I plus 18I is, I want to say 17I. I'm sorry, a negative 17I. And now again, I am in real plus imaginary form, where my real portion is 73 and my imaginary portion is negative 17. Let's try number 9 on your own. I have one more problem for you to try on your own, but I'd like you to start with number 9 and bring that on a piece of paper, as well as number 11 that I'm going to show you in just a minute. Number 10, we're going to write in A plus BI form. So I want to multiply by the conjugate. I need to first identify the conjugate. The conjugate of 2 plus I is 2 minus I. And so that is what I will multiply top and bottom. And in my denominator, I'm going to end up with 4 minus I squared. And in my numerator, I'm going to get 10 minus 5I plus 6I minus 3I squared. I'd like you to go ahead and do number 9 in its entirety. Simplify number 10 and read and do number 11 on a separate sheet of paper to turn in at the beginning of class tomorrow. I will see you then.